Well, we can speak now to Rachel Schmidtke. She is a senior advocate from Refugees International. What sort of conditions, can you give us more detail of the sort of conditions that refugees, migrants face if they are picked up by the police and held in Mexico?
Absolutely. So Mexico actually has a long track record of keeping migrants in these things called migration stations, which Mexico tends to use the word shelter as a euphemism for these stations, but really what they are de facto prisons. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the years is that the conditions in these migration stations are pretty abhorrent, overcrowding, people having not access to food and water, mistreatment by the National Migration Institute guards, just generally a lack of respect for their human rights and for their lives and dignity in these stations. And I think it's tragic because migrants in Mexico, migration is not necessarily a crime, and so, but they're being treated as if they were criminals in these migration stations.
And this is a terrible tragedy that has happened. Clearly, the authorities are still to investigate and find out how this happened. But do you think that there is any will, any political will, for conditions to be made better for the migrants?
I think the track record shows that no. Again, as I mentioned, this is not the first time that massive loss of migrants has occurred in Mexico. It's not even the first fire that's occurred in a migration station where a migrant has lost their lives. And so I think, unfortunately, there will be, I'm sure, an investigation launched, but really what this speaks to is a larger systemic issue in Mexico of the National Migration Institute not being held accountable for its human rights abuses and being able to operate with essentially impunity in Mexico, where they're able to treat migrants terribly without much consequences. And so I think that while there is a lot of attention being drawn to this horrifically tragic situation, a lot more needs to be done in order to ensure that things like this don't happen again, because this situation, I believe, was entirely preventable if the Mexican government had taken the steps to hold its National Migration Institute accountable.
And Rachel, typically, what sort of people will be trying to get over the border into the United States? Where are these people coming from, and why are they leaving their countries of origin?
Sure. So the majority of people that are at the border currently come from various countries in Latin America. The largest group of people that were in this detention center, this migration station, came from Guatemala, which we know that in Guatemala, a lot of people are fleeing real dire economic conditions, really high levels of extortion and abuses by gangs, as well as the government. Many of those people from Guatemala were indigenous, who historically have faced extreme discrimination and challenges in their country, and gender-based violence, for example, among other things. And so that's one of the reasons why they are fleeing. Another big group of people that were in the migration station were people from Venezuela. As we know, Venezuela is in the throes of a dictatorship with a terrible economic situation where 7.1 million Venezuelans have fled in the last few years from Venezuela because they simply cannot afford medication, food, basic necessities. And so a lot of them have, of course, gone into countries in Latin America, but more and more we're seeing Venezuelans come to the border. So, you know, every migrant has their own story and reasons for why they're leaving, but we can definitely point to deteriorating conditions in Latin America, corruption, and lack of access to justice, to safety, and to basic services are some of the main drivers.
Okay. Thank you very much for speaking to us. That's Rachel Schmidtke from Refugees International. Thank you.
Thank you.